The story of Vlad III is a dark tale that echoes deep into the human psyche, where fear mingles with fascination for a mind that disconnected from empathy and embraced cruelty as a form of identity. In his eyes, there was more than just the reflection of a ruler. There was the reflection of a man who, by losing himself in the darkness of violence, became a monster in his essence. The name Dracula echoes, but it is a name that represents not the greatness of a man, but the fall of a human being into a psychological abyss. Not just the man born in 1431, but the man who made himself in that name, a being shaped by pain, vengeance, and the absence of any link to humanity. Vlad III was born under the weight of a distant legacy. His father, Vlad II, belonging to the Order of the Dragon, a title that should have meant honor and defense. But for him, it was merely a symbol of a bloodline stained by empty promises and betrayals. The first distortion in his mind formed in the dark corridors of his childhood, where he witnessed his father and family treated with disdain, to the point where his family was seized by political enemies, turning the word trauma into a familiar and early language. Shocked by the violence around him, he saw how cruelty was a powerful currency, and his future aligned with it. However, it was during his captivity that he experienced a different kind of pain, one that was not only physical but also psychological. When he was freed, he didn't just seek revenge. He wanted the world to feel the weight of the same agony he had felt. Violence was no longer a reflection of power but a necessity for retribution against the fragility he had experienced in his childhood. Impalement was more than a method of punishment for Vlad. It was an expression of his absolute disdain for human life, a manifestation of his emotional unraveling. He watched his enemies slowly die in agonizing ways, and for him, it was more than an execution. It was a ritual of purification, where the body became an instrument of extreme suffering, and suffering became a form of power. The impalement was meticulously planned, but not with scientific precision. It was an aesthetic choice, almost artistic, for Vlad III. It wasn't about the speed of death, but about prolonging terror, allowing the suffering to stretch over hours or even days. He didn't want to just kill, he wanted to turn death into a performance, a message of total control. Unlike tyrants who rely on fear, but still experience a sense of guilt, Vlad III gave himself over to torture and execution with an almost sensory pleasure. Historical accounts suggest that he watched his prisoners agonize with a look almost of delight. He didn't see their pain as a necessary sacrifice, but as a means of personal pleasure. Vlad felt that the suffering of others was a direct reflection of his own existence, and his psychopathy seemed to feed on collective suffering. He didn't just administer pain, he reveled in it. In his twisted mind, the screams of his victims were not sounds of desperation, but a symphony of power. He saw his victims not as people, but as manifestations of his absolute domination. When he surrounded his cities with corpses on stakes, it was not just an attempt at intimidation. He was, in fact, creating a landscape of terror designed to provoke a sense of helplessness and chaos. To him, fear was not just a strategic tool, but an emotional field from which he fed. He was not an ordinary ruler. He was a mythical figure, an archetype of fear that projected out of reality. He fed on that warped psyche where suffering didn't just empower him, it made him divine. Vlad claimed to be driven by vengeance, by justice for his family and his people. But as his actions grew more intense, it became clear that revenge was not his true motivation. His psychopathy, although camouflaged in a mantle of nobility and honor, grew exponentially. It was no longer about retribution, but about the affirmation of his own identity, the need to be recognized as a god of destruction. The most disturbing thing about his psychopathy was that he showed no doubt about the legitimacy of his actions. He genuinely believed that his brutality was justified, that the fear he spread should be the foundation of any social order. Murder and torture were merely tools for a greater end, the reaffirmation of his position as the supreme force. He not only distorted the meaning of revenge, he distorted his very humanity. In his relentless pursuit of control and power, he lost any capacity for connection with others. He no longer felt the pain of his own crimes. With every stake driven into his enemies, he dug deeper into his own loss of identity, until he became a creature that no longer resembled the man who was born Vlad III. In Vlad's twisted mind, death was not an end, but a confirmation. He saw himself as someone who had power over life and death, and by killing, he not only dominated the lives of his enemies, he dominated the very idea of mortality. He saw himself as immortal, invulnerable, and his reign was an exhibition that even death he could control. In the end of his life, death finally reached him, but not without leaving an eternal impression on his psyche. In his final breath, he became a legend, but not the legend of a hero or martyr. The legend of a man who was consumed by his own insatiable need for pain and control. He was no longer human, but a distorted reflection of what humanity could become if it completely abandoned reason. Vlad III was not just a monster of his time, he was the dark reflection of what can happen when psychopathy meets absolute power. He was not defined just by his actions, but by how his mind twisted to the point where he lost all connection to what it meant to be human. And perhaps, in the end, that is the greatest terror of all. Vlad III's mind was not just cruel, it was a reflection of the darkness that can reside within all of us. The story of Vlad III does not end with the death of the monster he became. In fact, his legend continues to haunt the minds of those who have heard of his brutality, both in the past and in the present. He became not just a man of cruelty, but a myth that transcended the limits of reason, a force that extended far beyond his life, feeding fear and violence for generations. And his twisted mind continued to grow in our imagination as an untamable shadow, a representation of the depths of psychopathy. Vlad III became a legend of terror not only in his time but throughout history, shaping fear in such an intense way that he transformed into something greater than any historical figure or ruler. He is more than just a tyrant. He is a symbol of the darkest depths of the human soul, the capacity for a human being to lose themselves in the darkness and become an incomprehensible beast. However, the most frightening part is that this transformation was not forced upon him. He chose it, he embraced it, he became it. On the night of his death, his legend solidified, but Vlad III did not leave as a mere despotic ruler. He did not limit himself to the pantheon of cruel monarchs throughout history. He transcended, in form and essence, what can be understood as a human being. His mind could no longer be comprehended as that of a man, but as that of a creature that became the very incarnation of death. The terror he caused was so visceral, so intense, that he became a personification of terror in its purest and most primal form. But the greatest lesson Vlad III left to the world was not his cruelty or the methods he used. The real lesson was how he constructed an identity from his pain and suffering, turning those feelings into absolute power. Vlad III did not just inflict pain, he made it the foundation of his own existence. He used suffering as fuel, and with that, he shaped his psyche in such a distorted way that nothing could influence him anymore. The pain he caused was not just external, but internal. He carried the agony of his past, becoming a distorted reflection of human suffering itself. As the world distanced itself from him, his legend continued to grow and spread. His psychopathy was, in a way, his greatest legacy. He became more and more a symbol of immortal terror. In his mind, he was no longer seeking vengeance or power. He was creating something deeper, something that fed on his own destruction. His mind had become a fertile ground for human imagination, where fear and brutality intertwined like a macabre, eternal dance. And thus, the name of Vlad III would continue to be spoken, revered, and feared.